Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you. My name is Donald Ty. I'm on the board of directors of the Irish Network DC, and we're thrilled to be presenting this evening itself, as well as it being the third event over a 2-week period that we've been presenting in partnership with New York University DC and their DC Dialogues program. And I'd like to give a special shout out to Polly Terzian, Tom McIntyre, who help run the programs here. It's an incredible institution, as you can see by the beautiful venue, but it combines academic research, this kind of presentations that students are very involved in helping put together, and they also have dormitory space so the students are living here from NYU during the semester or the year when they're studying abroad. So it's been a joy to work with them and a real treat to be in this beautiful space. The 2-week program that I mentioned is one that you would have gotten to learn a little bit more about by looking at the Northern Ireland stories on the wall upstairs. That longer term program was called Northern Ireland Peace on the Eve of Brexit. And we've had a great couple of weeks. We showed the movie about the punk scene in Belfast during the Troubles 2 weeks ago, October 16th, called Good Vibrations, and had the incredible treat last Thursday, the 24th, of having a founding member and a big songwriter of the Stiff Little Fingers, Henry Clooney, here to perform. We did a great Q&A, and then he performed live for us with, well, I won't call it an acoustic guitar. It was plugged in as punk would require, but it was just one man, and he brought it to life for us, so we had a great time, and I know I recognized some faces from that as well. But as we wind down this and look ahead, in fact, that is the name of tonight's program, Looking Ahead, Beyond the Troubles and Brexit Towards Protecting the Peace. So later on this evening, we'll have the Ambassador of Ireland to the United States, His Excellency Dan Mulhall, speaking. But we wanted to kick it off with some unique insights and perspectives on both pre- and post-peace agreement, both the past and the present, and looking ahead about how things like the border, like the conflict in Northern Ireland, and now the peace as it has stood and faces the challenge of Brexit looking ahead. So we're very appreciative, pleased that we have some special guests, and we'll just make it a conversation, including welcoming you into the conversation. But Margery Myers here was the wife, now the widow, of the U.S. Consulate Myers to Belfast from 1986 to 1989. Is a DC native, been living here, so would be coming back and forth, and has some unique insights as an American diplomat over in Northern Ireland at that time. We've got Shane Greer, who's a Belfast-born, but also DC-based, is an international businessman and does a lot of work with Northern Ireland companies as well as throughout all of Europe, has studied in both Glasgow and London himself, but now runs Campaign and Elections, a trade consulting and strategy firm here in town. Aideen Gilmore, we're lucky to have her in DC now too, a Donegal woman, but who's done a lot of work and study in Belfast and all throughout Northern Ireland, including a lot of issues on social justice and human rights, obviously very pertinent and back in the headlines with Brexit. So we'll look forward to that input. And we're lucky to have Brian Cahalane, also from the Irish Embassy, who has traveled and been stationed almost in as many places as the ambassador, as we'll hear later, but also is a liaison now as a political officer and first secretary for the embassy here, dealing with Capitol Hill, our executive branch departments like the State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development. So despite his time in Geneva for Ireland, for the UN, and New York City, as well as Brussels, we're lucky to have you as well too. So thanks. Maybe we'll just ask y'all to start with sharing some of your own insights and perspectives, sort of what brings you here and what colors your perspectives on Northern Ireland now and as we segue into the next exciting months of Brexit, and we'll continue the conversation from there. So Margery, would you start us off?
Oh, we're starting by age, huh?
Best looking.
Okay. I'm very honored to be here, and I had wonderful.
Margery, I'll only interrupt to say the closer,
Let me help.
in
I have
fact,
to get
that's about
closer.
the way to go. I'd angle it towards you and keep it about an inch away.
That's good.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you
for
for
your
the help. I'm very pleased to be here, and I was just this past day I've been going over my memories of Belfast, which is now over 30 years ago that I was there, but a lot are still very fresh, and my children all, I had 3 boys, and they were, one went to school at Methody, and one visited in the summer and worked in the consulate, and one played hockey with the Peugeot Lions and got to know a lot of boys and girls. It was cute. And so he had a good time, and they all wanted me to be sure to, say something good about the time, because they all had a very, very positive experience, and they learned a lot. And so that's basically why I'm here.
Sounds like you got some dates out of the deal, huh?
Yeah.
We'll leave that for another evening, I think. Shane, how about yourself?
So I was born in County Down in Northern Ireland, a place called Newton Ards, but did my kind of formal education in Belfast. And my background on this is a little more nuanced than is often the case in Northern Ireland. My mother is from Enniscorthy in the Republic, and has, for as long as I remember, has been an avowed nationalist. In my youth, I remember her on occasion referring to Northern Ireland as the occupied 6 counties. My father is of Scots Presbyterian descent, and I grew up in Unionist, Loyalist communities. I was born in Tullycarnet, which is a UDA estate, in part of the Dundonald, the Belfast conglomeration. And I myself am a British member of the Conservative Party, but happily carry an Irish passport. As a result, you get a slightly more nuanced perspective than might be the case had I been in either camp, kind of growing up. So that's kind of a summary of my slightly odd segue.
You're spanning the spectrum
A little bit.
and I think that probably plays an interesting bit of input into your education, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Appreciate that. Aideen, hi, what's going on?
Hey, Donald. So I guess personally and professionally, my attachment to the Brexit debate now and looking ahead forward is someone who grew up in the border area of Donegal. My family lived 25 miles from Derry. My granny was from Derry. We spent a lot of our youth crossing the border into Derry and experiencing, the security and militarization of that border. And as a child, you know that a soldier taking you out of the car and searching the car, even though it's normal, is not normal. So I think for my family now, I have like a brother, a sister-in-law who all work in Derry and live in Donegal. At least one other member of my family a day will cross the border. So between us, we make like at least 8 border crossings a day. And looking forward now to the potential of a border post-Brexit, I think is something that would be interesting perhaps for the audience to talk about from the border community perspective. Professionally then, as you say, I worked on human rights in Northern Ireland for almost 20 years. Too much to go into in a couple of minutes, but we did a lot of work around reform of the policing service, reform of the criminal justice system, trying to embed equality and discrimination provisions into legislation and policy, dealing with cases that had never been properly investigated, killings, collusion, advocating for a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland. So 20 years of work of implementing the peace, and I think that's an important reflection to bring forward as well, as the peace agreement was very much the start of a process, and a long process of implementation that went, and Brian will know this because he was on the government side of things, behind the scenes, hard, unseen, constant work that can't be taken for granted and shouldn't be put at risk, I think, going forward. So, so professionally, I think for a lot of the human rights community in Northern Ireland, there's anxiety about what Brexit will mean for the hard-fought human rights protections over the last 20 years.
I think you mentioning that word normal and normalcy is something that we can return to, because that's part of the question that's being raised, I think, by your point. So, Brian, I mentioned some of the places you've worked throughout your career with the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But one thing I didn't mention is you've focused on Northern Ireland, sometimes from Belfast and sometimes from Dublin, and of course, obviously now here from DC. So sort of what got you here? What was your road?
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks to Irish Network DC for organising this event and indeed the series. Just on a personal level, my parents, my mother was from Galway, my father was from Cork. They met in Dublin. They got married in 1965 and went on their honeymoon to Northern Ireland. But then, because of the Troubles, which started shortly afterwards, we never visited as a family while we were growing up. Mainly because, well, I guess partly because of the Troubles, and then mainly because that we didn't have any family connections in Northern Ireland. But then I professionally then became a Foreign Service officer. And the first time that I visited Northern Ireland was actually to attend a colleague's wedding in Temple Patrick, so it was, and that was in the late 1990s. So it was more than 30 years after my parents had been there on their honeymoon. But then, yeah, as you say, Donald, I was working in Dublin from 2011 to 2014 as part of the team covering Northern Ireland from Dublin, travelling there frequently, attending party conferences, talking to people in the activist space on the human rights side, meeting politicians in Stormont and in Derry and Belfast and elsewhere at council, municipal authority level. Then I was based in Dublin, or in Belfast rather, for a year from 2014, where I was deputy head of the Irish Government Office in Belfast, and again continuing similar work, basically being a representative for the Irish government in Belfast. And then since I came to Washington, part of my role is to keep the Irish American community and the staff of members of Congress with an interest in Northern Ireland and indeed Brexit, which is, as it were, I think, pushed the issues here up the agenda, so to speak, in the sense there had been a perception prior to Brexit that the issues here were, or the issues in Northern Ireland were solved, or at least were, on their way to being solved. So I have that perspective, but thanks.
And I bet as you think back to your mind having that word solved in your mind and your professional perspective, as if it's a past tense issue or sort of whatever, stop change, in diplomacy that doesn't happen. But let's turn to that issue of normalcy as a concept for a second. And Margery, for you to move your family from America to Belfast, obviously you must have had to be conscious of how to care for your kids, teach them, well, what is our new normal, or what is the normal here, or the situation? What was that like?
Right. Well, they became acutely, they became acutely aware of the new normal for them when we were told that the day before we arrived, there had been a bombing at it was a buffet restaurant just down the hill from Ardna Valley. That was apparently a hangout for the RUC, and it was a target. And immediately after that, it was said that we had to have a fence put up, which we did, a big stockade fence. It was beautifully put up 5 days a week, but not on weekends. No, they didn't work. We learned, but it was very nice fence, and it had a locking gate, and that was where we drove the car through, and my sons were just so pleased. We were gated, this was really high class, and they used the clicker while they were in the back seat of the car as the car was going through, and the door was very quick, and went and gave a nice waste to the poor Volvo, got a little waste.
Crunch.
Crunch. French, and so they learned. I mean, there were some fun things. Actually, the best protection we had were the geese, and they had always been the protection, and they were still very very effective
On the consulate
on the
property there.
consulate property. They just walked around, and no, they honked and they did other things, and no, you got goosed and you knew.
And separate from your own sort of the microcosm of your family
Right.
home, you guys, 86 to 89, would have been there in 87 for the Enniskillen bombing.
We were.
Was that kind of thing become part of the family issue, or did you feel it was separate enough? I mean, obviously your husband was there in a diplomatic role.
He was there in a diplomatic role, and we took it. By that point, we all felt very close to the people that were around us, the people that in the consulate, and then our neighbors and the people that worked for us, and a lot of people that we met at the hospital.
I was going to add, Margery was a family physician through her career as well, and I know you were on a sabbatical for part of the time
Right, I was on
when you were over there,
sabbatical,
but that continued to be part of your life. Share
I
that.
was at Royal Victoria just about every day, first visiting some Americans who had unfortunate accidents. One was a famous, Matthew Broderick, had a very unfortunate accident, and he still feels very, very penitent for having driven on the wrong side of the road, which can happen, as we know, has happened recently again, and he killed 2 women. But I helped when he was in the hospital, and with his girlfriend Jennifer Gray at the time, we had fun. It was interesting because we had to be sure that he had a telephone in his room. Not rooms didn't have telephones, it was different. But other than that, he was very very nice, and did bring a movie. We had his Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and showed it in the big ward at the Royal Victoria Hospital, and it was very well received by all the nurses and the patients. They enjoyed Ferris Bueller. So, I mean, that was fun. But we also had somebody that was a very serious accident, and a horsewoman, artist from New York, who was on a bus that just had a terrible accident. And she was the last person that they triaged. And she ended up with very serious injuries. So she was in the ICU for nearly 2 months. And they couldn't believe that anybody could survive that long in an ICU, but I had seen it in America. And I said, no, she's young, she's strong, she can do it, she'll make it if we just keep treating everything. And she's still a friend. She's somewhat disabled, but she survived.
And had you mentioned that you were visiting after the Enniskillen?
I'm sorry, yes, indeed. And after that, I was able to, I knew the nurses and the doctors in the wards and all, and so I was able to visit there were many injured. I think there were like 63 at least were injured, and 11 killed in Enniskillen in this bombing, which was admitted to be a mistake, but apparently was used somewhat as a way to turn public opinion against the PRA, the IRA, but the provisional group.
Let's stick with this concept of what does normal mean now, and might we hope it to be for the future. Shane, you have been an international businessman. You're a co-owner now of Campaigns and Elections, but work with firms and campaigns throughout the world, including some I know in Northern Ireland. Do you feel the change from across the Atlantic? What's your sense of current status and maybe hopeful trend lines?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about it is when you look at, you touched a little bit on kind of the perverse normalcy that, we experienced growing up, and whether, one trivial example I'll give, when I left Northern Ireland, and I was one of those, as soon as I finished my sort of final exams, I was on a boat over to Liverpool, and it was about 10 years before I went back again. But I distinctly remember my first day in Liverpool. We went down to the city centre, and in the main street in Liverpool, they had this thing called the Cop Shop. And the Cop Shop was a storefront, a glass-fronted storefront that was like a downtown police station of sorts. You could go in and, ask the police questions or, whatever. And I remember standing outside it, and this was like, I didn't have a mobile phone or anything, but I remember standing outside it and just being completely perplexed that someone would build a police station with glass. You know, I mean, you're just making a nail bomb. Like, what are you doing? But it was a moment that was jarring for me because I realized how profoundly not normal the experience in Northern Ireland was, where police stations are heavily fortified. They had blast walls going in. They had big fences to stop, explosive devices being thrown over the top and things like that. And to the point about change, though, what's striking now when you go back is the tremendous progress that a city like Belfast has made. One need only walk around the cathedral, or indeed many other parts of the city, to see the transformation, to see these huge modern buildings go up, glass buildings again. I'll return to that theme. Phenomenal restaurants, write-ups in the New York Times. But I think we have to also be careful about overstating the significance of that change, because it's easy to, I think, look at that and assume that, oh, well, it's all coasting toward ultimate normalcy and stability and peace and tranquility. But actually bubbling under that, there remain tremendous problems. And we're seeing some of that come to the fore now. I don't think specifically as a result of Brexit, I think that's been a trigger for it. But much more deeply, we're still a country, a place that's profoundly conflicted, that never really came to terms with what happened, that never, you touched on kind of historic abuses. There was never the kind of the peace and reconciliation process that perhaps one saw in like a South Africa or a Sierra Leone, an opportunity for people, from all sides to kind of confront the horrors of what went on. So there's been tremendous progress. You see a growing private sector, still tiny by comparison to what's happening in the Republic or indeed in England, but that we shouldn't allow that to cloud our vision to these tremendous problems that kind of bubble under the bottom and need addressing long term as things change.
And I think a word I'm thinking of hearing you speak, Shane, is the sense of fragility, and we shouldn't sort of overlook that. And good for a New York Times doing a 36 hours in Belfast and showing that it is so accessible. But Aideen, you in your entire career have worked on those edges of those maybe not ensured of human rights or of safety or security. And that seems to me to be linked to that sense of fragility that maybe we're seeing on a larger view. Do you feel that some of the work you have done and do is now closer to the surface, getting worse, or maybe we're just getting more aware of it? Where does that sense of fragility fall for you?
There was a huge amount of work done and achieved and banked in terms of implementation of the peace in human rights terms. If we take policing, for example, the transformation that took place from the RUC, the old police service, to the Police Service of Northern Ireland, the change in composition, the human rights compliance that is now the oversight mechanisms, the accountability mechanisms, I think they're all normal now, and they're reasonably safe. Likewise, changes to the criminal justice system. But I also know, for example, then the police themselves and human rights organisations are concerned about what the potential border infrastructure could start to unravel on some of that. So if you have to start policing a border again, and that becomes a target for paramilitary organisations, and where does that path lead in a situation like Northern Ireland? I think from a human rights perspective, we have enough oversight and accountability and complaint mechanisms put in place post-agreement that we would never return to some of the human rights violations that we saw in the course of the conflict in Northern Ireland. But I think there is still a link between the fragility of what could happen in a border area, for example. Likewise, in human rights protections terms, a lot of particularly the equality and non-discrimination law that was at the heart of the implementation of the peace agreement is based on a European Union legal framework and on the European Convention of Human Rights, the European Court of Human Rights. And while the withdrawal agreement talks about no diminution of those rights, I think there's still a lack of certainty and clarity about what that will look like in practice. And there were parts of the Good Friday Agreement that were never quite implemented, like a Bill of Rights, for example. And I know in the US, you all get the importance of a Bill of Rights as a constitutional embodiment and protection of your rights. And that still has not been delivered. So could that be a way then perhaps of embedding some of those European European Court of or Convention of Human Rights going forward? So there was a lot done. There's a lot I think that is banked that will not change, but I think there are steps that we still need to take, particularly in the uncertain years ahead.
I think it's a striking point you make about complaint and response mechanisms. And yes, they're there, and to your excellent phrase, are banked, but the maintenance and protection of them will take effort and resources of time and money and oversight. So by definition, that's resources that aren't going elsewhere too. Necessary, it's job one, but an interesting warning sign, I think, with whatever change the next few months show us. So Brian, we had said the word normalcy, but I would be inclined to think as a diplomat, maybe we can all look back and say we should have known better, than to be to be complacent following 1998. But having worked in Belfast and Dublin on Northern Ireland issues, what's your sense now? Obviously, the ambassador will be talking forward-looking global diplomacy issues for us in a little bit. But in the doing of the work, and you here interfacing with some Capitol Hill centers of power and interest in Northern Ireland issues too, what's your sense of normalcy, change, protections, concerns?
Well, thanks. I think on the one hand, as others have said, a lot of progress has been made. I mean, for example, I used to represent the department and the minister at UUP and DUP party conferences as an observer. I mean, that wouldn't have been possible during the Troubles, or indeed in some cases even after the Good Friday Agreement. So there was a normalcy in that sense. But then, as others have said, the work that still needs to be done on reconciliation, on integrated education, or at least some form of shared education, I think there are challenges that still remain. I mean, here in the US, what I've been struck by, both by interaction with Irish America and with Irish American members of Congress and their staff, and indeed the administration, is the extent of the US commitment and that manifested itself financially through more than $500 million to the International Fund for Ireland, which was established in '86 following the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985, but also the sustained interest in terms of the ongoing US presence in Belfast and the attention that senior State Department officials give it, visiting members of Congress. And while, under the current administration, there isn't an envoy as such, but the US consulate in Belfast and their colleagues here in DC are very involved, both with the political parties and with the two governments and with civil society, for example, through having people from Northern Ireland attend the White House reception and other events over the St. Patrick's Day period.
And certainly I can speak from my experience in time with the Irish Network DC, the hand-in-glove partnership of work that the Northern Ireland Bureau and the Embassy of the Republic of Ireland do. It's inspiring. I know it's nationwide work, and in fact, the NIB is all of North America. They're up in Canada as well, where I know the embassy here is focused on the United States. So that's an inspiring and maybe a glimmer of hopefulness as well. But I think, to Shane's phrase earlier, not to the point of glossing over any reality. A manifestation of that maybe we see with how Stormont had not been formed for a couple of years now, and when there's just not a coming together, that can be an issue of concern. Margery, when we talk about trying to move forward instead of backwards, and if I could mention to Polly, I don't know if we have any other mics or we'd need to share one, but if the audience has questions after this one or two, we might welcome that as well, because I know the ambassador will be with us before 8 o'clock as well. And the conversations just go so fast. But for example, there you are, an American traveling in throughout Northern Ireland. I know you traveled throughout, but were there times where you were stopped in a car, or what was your point of interface with some of the security apparatus there?
Oh, well, the border, between, the Republic and.
As Aideen was mentioning, yeah.
Yeah, when we would go down to Dublin, of course, there was a border there, near, there's Dundalk and all those places along the border. And we were, and of course in Derry as well. And of course it was called Londonderry, The Northern people, Northern Irish was always called it Londonderry. But we were stopped there, and of course in just within Belfast itself, going into my the little compound where the consulate was, it was like here. The only comparison I have is to going into the Congress or the Senate. If you're going into the Capitol with a car, you get your boot and your hood, the whole thing, the trunk and everything is examined, and you really get the full thing. And that was every day.
Yeah, it's just part of life then. The of all the mechanisms that the Society of Northern Ireland may choose and already works on to try to change or evolve, education is one of them. And Shane, your insight is interesting. You shared with me in our conversation that you attended maybe the first integrated school, and you remain active in that effort. If you could share your perspective and experience.
Yeah, so I attended Lygon College, which was founded in 1981 in a scout hut in the outskirts of Belfast, and for the first time in a planned way brought together 50% Catholic, 50% Protestant children, and opened under enormous protest. It's worth saying. And the movement has grown tremendously since then. But, and I say this, but the vast majority of children in Northern Ireland, well over 80%, 85% in fact, are still in de facto segregated education, by which I mean they're going to a Catholic school, or they're going to what you would call here a public school, a state school, which is de facto Protestant. And I do want to touch on something, which is there is this talk of like integrated education versus shared education. Integrated education is where you have one institution at which both Catholics and Protestants are educated together, attending the same classes, shared religious education, so they understand one another's culture and practices, and indeed cultures and practices from other religions. Shared education is where you have two institutions and they share some facilities and they come together for certain classes or for certain sporting events. And I think that's total BS. It's a cop-out. And why is that even posited as an option? Frankly, because if you're the Shinners, it doesn't help you. If you've got Catholic schools being educated, or Catholic kids being educated with Protestant kids, if you're the DUP, it doesn't help you to have Protestant kids being educated with Catholic kids, because it starts to break down the divisions. It starts to break down the communities that you rely on for your support. And and it's as a result of that support that we find ourselves at the current impasse. The Good Friday Agreement was designed to try and bring the communities together and provide a structure in which decisions could be made. And that was maybe fine when the UUP and the SDLP were at prominence and were prepared to compromise. But that passed. And now we have two, I think, dangerous parties for Northern Ireland at the helm, particularly the DUP. I mean, good God. But that's as a result of the support that they have within their communities and the fear of the other. And that's only supported by segregated education, which we have every single day. So to your point, I'm a trustee of Integrated AlumNI, which is a Northern Ireland nonprofit charity that seeks to promote integrated education. And the reality is, I didn't sort of knowingly meet my first Catholic until I was 11, and it went all right. His name's Pete. He's got like 73 aunts and uncles. I have like 2. But what was so funny about it was I remember growing up, and I mentioned that I grew up in kind of unionist loyalist communities, despite my mother being a nationalist. She was like low-key. I remember being told that Catholics' eyes were closer together, right? I'm not joking. I'm being completely serious. To my surprise, Pete's weren't. Okay, his mother's eyes were the same. But it speaks to how when you're segregated in different communities, these kind of absurdities can grow up. And the other can seem so other. And one of the things that I think is underappreciated by folks outside Northern Ireland who have an interest in Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland is how much segregation in education in Northern Ireland serves to support the divisions that created the problems in the past and perpetuate them today. The final point I'll make on this is, you mentioned growing up in the border region and family in Derry. Look at the rise of dissident republicanism in Derry. That's one example of it. Move over to Belfast, and I don't know if people here are familiar with Jamie Bryson. Horrendous individual. Jamie is a loyalist malcontent, a populist of sorts for loyalist victimhood. And as a result of this simmering concern in the loyalist community that, closer integration with Ireland, blah, 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 the usual sort of nonsense. Individuals like that are stoking up tensions that had started at some level to dissipate. Again, that's all because of the kind of segregated communities we still have in education and residence and so on.
Which I think speaks to what we've also talked about earlier tonight about what are some things to keep sort of on the watch list of being careful for no matter what the change that evolves. As we begin to wind down, Polly and Luke, if there's any questions from the audience, we'd welcome you to raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you. Because this will be archived and available on the NYU DC Dialogues page down the road. I see one there, and if there's more than one, we'll take it, and otherwise we'll take one and then segue from there to a wrap-up.
Herbert Curry. Yeah, sorry about that. Thank you very much for an interesting discussion. I'd like to hear more about some of the smaller parties in Northern Ireland, particularly the Green Party, or other options that are available that might bring the community together in a way that facilitates this exchange, this integration that you've talked about, whether it's for economic reasons, whether it's for climate change and whatnot. And secondly, in terms of citizens' assemblies that seem to function very well in the Republic of Ireland, regarding abortion and other issues, whether these types of civil engagement might serve Northern Ireland as it's, whatever happens with Brexit over the next few weeks. Thank you.
And allow me to take that as a means for us to do a wrap up, because I'll take your word parties specifically, and maybe Shane, you'll have some thoughts on that, as any of us might, but let's also broaden it to mean stakeholders. And so as we look ahead, what are some things that are on your mind, either that we need to watch for or protect for participation, for having a voice, or to watch for? What are some of the players that are on your mind through your personal and professional perspectives as we look ahead? And we'll wrap up with these remarks.
Thank you. Just in terms of going forward post-Brexit, when indeed it happens and what form it takes, but we will continue working closely with the Northern Ireland Bureau here and with the British Embassy. So, that will be an important part of our work going forward. Then I think obviously re-establishing relationships or repairing relationships rather, I think will be very important. There's certainly been a fraying of relationships because of Brexit within Northern Ireland, between North and South, and between Britain and Ireland. So that sort of work, I think, will be very important. Getting the institutions back up and running, the Assembly and the Executive and the North-South Ministerial Council, and then the ongoing work around reconciliation, which our government has continued to support, since the Good Friday Agreement and since and through the whole Brexit process that we're currently going through.
Sort of on all fronts, so sobering points taken.
Yeah, and I will say it speaks somewhat to the last point. There is and always has been a very strong and organised civil society in Northern Ireland. Going back through the conflict, there was a very strong network of community organisations on both sides of the community. And it was those community organisations, women's organisations, who were fundamental in building peace in the communities themselves, bringing young people together, bringing women together, was very important in building the peace. When it came to implementing the peace agreement, again, there was a very strong civil society presence in monitoring the implementation of the peace agreement and ensuring that the various human rights and equality provisions were implemented. And I think over the last number of years, with the suspension of the Northern Ireland Assembly, again, it has been civil society that has sort of stepped up to the plate and kept Northern Ireland functioning somewhat and carrying out some of the sort of semi-policy and research functions that perhaps a functioning assembly should do. And recently we've seen, for example, I think absolute political genius on the part of civil society in Northern Ireland in terms of the campaign for legalisation of abortion and marriage equality in the absence of elected representation in Northern Ireland. So, I think that's something that Northern Ireland can always rely on going forward through Brexit and through this uncertainty.
And I'll just add that from our Irish Network DC perspective and the strong work the Northern Ireland Bureau does in the years of leadership by Norman Houston and Richard Krishney here, they continue to bring over leaders from across their civil service spectrum, heading international affairs. Senator McCormick was just here on a panel with the ambassador and on all the fronts, and it's been a very impressive resilience, certainly on their end. We'll end with Shane, but did you want to have any final words, Margery?
The only thing, the importance of people to people and getting to know people and not fear people was very important. And we were very much involved with a group called Project Children, which was started by the Mulcahy brothers, and Dennis and his brother. Dennis was a fireman from New York, and a policeman, actually, a bomb squad man. And the point was that we brought kids, Protestants and Catholic kids, together, and they lived together with an American family. And the Mulcahy started this in New Jersey in this little house. It's not a big house, but they had big hearts, and they had always room for the kids. And they got to see life without the troubles of life. Also, they get to know each other in a neutral place, and that I'm hoping still goes on. Those little people-to-people changes that made a difference, and those people have gone on to do really good things and been able to.
That's a great point. I appreciate you mentioning it. And obviously there's both informal or nonprofit or charity groups that do some of that kind of work. And then there's also the formal kind, like Sister City things that can really make the people to people work and come together. I wouldn't want to miss the chance to mention that an offshoot of Project Children is very active here in this city currently, the Washington Ireland Program for Service and Leadership.
Absolutely.
And they have usually around undergrad and graduate school students who come here every summer, and now they have programs up in New York, and they're placed in throughout the DC world, government, nonprofit, educational sectors, and others. And they make, I won't say they make incredible leaders, but they sure do help nurture them. And in fact, maybe a tie with the current Taoiseach will come up in a later remarks this evening, we'll have to say. Shane, we'll end with your final remarks just because the word party was mentioned, and with your campaign and elections work, any thoughts you want to share or add to that as part of your wrap up?
Yeah, sure. And I'll make 3 points, and I want to pick, one of them is to pick up on a point you were making about the tremendous kind of civil organizations in Northern Ireland, which has been tremendous throughout its history. Integrated education was started by a community group. It was individuals with kids and without who came together and decided they wanted to do this. And I think it's important just briefly to reflect on, in 1981, the bravery that it required. I mean, anyone here who has kids will understand this. The bravery it required to put your head up and send your child to an integrated school from your community. I mean, I can't imagine what that took, but the debt of gratitude that my generation owes to those people is profound. The 2 points I'll make about the party politics side of it. One is kind of to answer the question that was asked about smaller parties, and that's a shorter term question. And then there's a longer term point to make. There are smaller parties. It's Northern Ireland. We like a lot of parties, just like the Protestant side of the faith. I guess my side likes to jump into like 57 different like micro groups. The Alliance Party is an obvious one, did tremendously well in the European elections. One could also point to the UUP and the SDLP, once the kind of the titans of Northern Irish politics and now less so. But the hope for these smaller parties, and not because I think they deserve anything because they're smaller parties, but one hopes that because of the position they occupy, they occupy a position which is given more to compromise and to understanding that you can only govern through compromise and that you are elected to represent all the people. My hope for those parties is that we see this growing group in Northern Ireland of the not aligned. We started to see this in the 2011 census when for the first time Northern Irish became an identity that people took on rather than just British or Irish. Of course, it was younger people who overwhelmingly adopted that. We see this not aligned group growing, and it's a big reason why the Alliance Party, finally broke out of Belfast and did so well in the European elections. Let's not assume for a second that we're going to see transformation overnight, but the seeds are there. The other point I want to make, which is the kind of the gauntlet that I think Brexit throws down, and I don't know what's going to happen there. If anyone does, just let me know and I'll go to the bookies. But the big lesson there, more than anything else, tells us something about the elephant in the room, which is unification of Ireland. I've long felt, listen, I'm saying this as a British Tory, right? From Northern Ireland, whose mother's a nationalist. I've always felt that it seemed to me to be an inevitability, but maybe I'm wrong. But regardless, it behooves the political leadership, I think particularly in Dublin and Westminster, to think very, very long term about this, to think deeply about what kind of questions are being asked. Mark Daly, Senator Daly, the Republic, has done a lot of work on this, as have many others. But the challenge with that issue in Brexit, I think in some senses brings it to the fore, is if you look at Northern Ireland now, you have latest polling from, there's not a lot of polling done there, but the latest polling done by Lord Ashcroft, UK pollsters, showed that 46% to 45% of people in Northern Ireland were in favor of unification. So unification was ahead of staying in the UK. Now that's not enough necessarily to make a difference, but that's huge. That's huge. Bear in mind, going back to the 2011 census, that was the first time that Protestants in Northern Ireland fell below 50% of the population. Within unionism, 1/3 of unionists feel, and this is a poll done last month, 1/3 of unionists feel that Brexit makes unification more likely. And 39% of my party in England, largely, doesn't really care what happens. Quite happy for Northern Ireland to leave and become back part of the Republic of Ireland. The point to make there is the failure of the Brexit referendum in its construct was to be really opaque about what was on the other side. Like, you're voting for something, but what are you really voting for? I think if we envisage that there may be a vote at some point on a united Ireland, it is incredibly important that that thing is very well defined and that all of the communities are considered before the question is constructed. Because it's not enough to say, should there be unification? That's far too simple a question. And if that question isn't asked well, it isn't well constructed, we find ourselves in a quagmire that would make Brexit look like a walk in the park.
The add to the list of the things, sort of the lessons learned to be looking at afterwards. Shane, Greer, Margery Myers, Aideen Gilmore, Brian Cahalane, thank you all very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Thank you.